While I was reflecting on the scriptures for last Sunday, I was also having a read of this book, The Only Way to Make Bread, by Cristina Quintero and Sarah Gonzales. And it's actually about all of the variations in the ingredients and methods that different families and different cultures use to make bread. But it says there's a couple of things that are always important. It's always important to share the bread, and you always need to make the bread with love. The scripture that I'll be reflecting on is from the Epistle to the Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 11 to 22, and Mark's Gospel, chapter 6, verse 30 to 56. And I'm wondering, what are your memories of bread when you were growing up? What was bread like for your family? What did it smell like? What did it taste like? What was the texture? Did you make it at home or did you buy it from a shop? Was it something you had every day or was it something for special occasions? In this part of Mark's Gospel, we're getting to one of the bread bits. We've, in the past weeks, been going through Mark's Gospel and we've heard about Jesus saying that his kingdom is like a little seed that grows and becomes a blossoming bush that provides shelter and food for all kinds of little creatures. And we've heard about Jesus and his followers crossing over the sea to visit their foreign neighbours. And we've heard about Jesus being interrupted when he's on his way to an important appointment, but he stops to care for somebody who's been sick and isolated for a really long time, for 12 years. We've heard about Jesus sending his followers out in pairs to go and see where they are welcome, and where people are happy to have them in the communities, caring for people and telling people about Jesus. Now we're hearing about those disciples returning to Jesus from the communities where they've been staying. And he says to them, let's go out into the wilderness where we can rest. There have been so many people needing their care, it would be easy to be overwhelmed and exhausted by the amount of need that there is. It makes sense that they would need to get out into the middle of nowhere in order to rest and recuperate and just be themselves. We might also notice something that Jesus is doing here. He's starting to recreate the ancient Jewish story of the Exodus from Egypt, the story of ancient Israel's liberation from slavery. They had been slaves and they had cried out for liberation. God had heard them. God had asked Moses to lead them out into the wilderness so that they could worship God. When their masters pursued them into the wilderness, God separated the sea so that the people of Israel could walk across the sea to escape. Moses went up a mountain to be with God, and God gave Moses 10 commandments that would help Israel to live as free people. When they had worried about what they were going to eat, God provided food from the wilderness, and they had more than they needed, so they could rest. They didn't have to work every day of the week to get what they needed. They could take the seventh day as a day of rest and worshiping God, spending time with their family. So when Jesus is saying to them, let's go out into the wilderness to rest, Jesus is recreating that story. He's saying, let's go out into the wild, away from the city, where our people are being oppressed. Let's go out into the bush and be free to rest and to recreate and to pray and to be ourselves. When they do arrive at the quiet coastal area that Jesus has had in mind, it turns out that everyone else has gone there ahead of them. They've followed Jesus out into the wilderness to be free, just like how God had led their ancestors into the wilderness so that they could be free from slavery. Things are hard because they're controlled by a foreign power, their king is cruel, and the temple is corrupt. They're looking for someone to lead them. And when everyone starts getting hungry in the wilderness, the disciples want to send people away to buy food separately. They're wanting to send them back into the city to buy food. But Jesus doesn't have that idea in mind. Jesus remembers the story of people being fed in the wilderness and having enough. He finds out what little bit of food that they've got, and they share it together as one big household. And it turns out that when they choose to share like one big family, instead of being separate little families, they actually have enough. There's plenty. There's 12 baskets left over, one for each of the traditional separate family groups of ancient Israel. It's saying that they'll have enough if they all share what they have together. There'll be enough for the whole nation. After this, Jesus finally has some time to stop and rest. He goes up the mountain to pray, to talk with God, just like how Moses did in the ancient story. And then, to catch up with the disciples because they've headed off in the boat, he walks on the water. The disciples are frightened because they haven't understood that Jesus is reenacting that ancient story of walking across the sea into freedom. Jesus is showing that the people need to be led into freedom again. They need to be freed from ceaseless labor. They need to be reminded that there's more than enough. They need to be reminded that they can stop and rest and pray and be with their families. And we need that now in our society as well. We need freedom. In our society, we need to be able to not have to work every moment. We need to be able to stop our minds, not just our bodies. We need to be able to be reminded that there's more than enough if we just share what we have. We need to be able to stop and rest and be with God, be with our loved ones, even though there's still things to be done. In my family, one of the things that we've been finding helpful is just stopping before we eat the meal, before we gather to eat a meal, and lighting a candle and taking some time where we all remember what we're thankful for, and we just say what we're thankful for. It doesn't always go smoothly, but we're learning to do this. In his letter to the church in Ephesus, Paul has been talking about how God has brought all of us out of slavery so that we can all be equal as God's children in God's household, all eating together at God's table. And in today's reading from Ephesians, Paul is saying that this vision of a good life in God's household is no longer just for the Jewish people. It's no longer just for people who follow the Jewish traditions like circumcision and kosher diet. Paul is saying that there's now room in their house and room at the table for people from all nations. Everyone is welcome to bring their particular kind of bread. I encourage you to take a moment to just stop and be quiet and still and listen to what God's Spirit might be saying to you as you reflect.